As several analysts have pointed out, when a bridge like this sits unfinished, the real damage often isn't economic at all. It's about trust and about the symbolism of a promise left unkept. Either way, one thing becomes hard to deny. Russia is emerging from this war visibly diminished, having paid a steep price for every gain it's made, and China is watching every part of this very, very closely. All of this connects to a much bigger question sitting quietly in the background: Taiwan. Because China is studying exactly how much Russia has struggled throughout this war and taking careful notes. According to Professor Brown, a Chinese move against Taiwan would be an event on a vastly larger global scale than Russia's invasion of Ukraine ever was. That's part of why Brown remains skeptical of predictions that China will make a move sometime around 2027. Beijing has an enormous amount to lose. If it attacked Taiwan, American involvement would still be highly likely. International backlash would still be severe, and none of it would come easily, regardless of how large China's military or economy has grown. China is looking directly at Russia's example as a warning sign. The war in Ukraine has already outlasted the entire duration of the First World War. If China found itself stuck in something even remotely similar over Taiwan, it would be catastrophic, not just for China and Taiwan, but for the entire global economy. What China is studying isn't only the military stalemate either. The effectiveness of Western sanctions against Russia is functioning as a live laboratory for Beijing. Frozen reserves, cut-off access to critical technology, an economy being slowly strangled over time, all of it is being carefully logged into China's own cost-benefit calculations for any future Taiwan scenario. In other words, without meaning to, Russia is handing China a real-world case study answering one very specific question: what does it actually cost a great power to become isolated? Professor Brown's overall thesis is fairly clear. China probably does have some kind of long-term plan for Taiwan, but it's genuinely long-term, not something likely to unfold within the next few years. Things could look very different once the world moves further into the 2030s. And even that depends heavily on China's economic performance and a long list of other shifting variables. China, at its core, behaves like a rational actor, not a gambler. If it eventually makes a move, it will likely do so only once it feels reasonably confident it can achieve its goals, meaning specifically that the United States won't get directly involved. And right now, we're clearly nowhere close to that point, because American involvement in global conflicts remains very real and very active. One caveat worth adding here: the world is moving through an extraordinary period of change right now. 5 years, 10 years from now, this entire picture could look completely different. So how confidently should we actually read all of this? Let's be honest about the limits of what anyone truly knows. Nobody, no analyst, no journalist, no outside observer, has direct access to what's really going on inside Xi Jinping's head, or inside Putin's. The real calculations happening behind closed doors in Beijing and Moscow stay behind closed doors. There's also another side to this coin worth acknowledging. Despite all this asymmetry we've walked through, Russia and China do run a real deepening partnership. Joint military exercises, massive energy contracts, a shared rhetorical front against the Western-led global order. Reducing this entire relationship down to simple Russian desperation would be an oversimplification. Beijing genuinely benefits from this alignment too, through cheap, steady energy and a distraction that keeps the West occupied and stretched thin elsewhere. China's internal weaknesses shouldn't be overstated either. Yes, it faces real economic pressure, demographic decline, and political friction beneath the surface, but it remains the world's second largest economy and a rapidly growing military power. Saying China isn't quite as strong as it appears doesn't mean China is actually weak. Those are two very different claims. And finally, we shouldn't lose sight of the human cost buried underneath all this geopolitical maneuvering. On this particular chessboard, the pieces being moved around aren't abstract concepts on a map. North Korean soldiers sent to fight on the Kursk front stay there for months at a time, far from home in brutal conditions. And on the other end of this war, ordinary civilians in Ukrainian cities targeted by Russian strikes pay an equally devastating price. While the world debates the balance of power between great nations, it's almost always the smallest, most vulnerable people who end up paying the actual bill. The real signal worth watching going forward isn't the next staged summit photo op. It's whether that bridge between Russia and North Korea finally opens. It's whether Xi makes another trip to Pyongyang, and it's whether China eventually tells Russia, clearly and directly, that it's time to calm things down. Because when an empire that once carried a century of great power tradition, armed with nuclear warheads and vast territory, reaches a point where it can no longer afford to let go of a single neighbor's hand, what it's actually losing isn't just bargaining power. It's losing its claim to control its own destiny. And once that claim slips away, getting it back is far harder than winning any war. But there's another twist in this story, one that's landing an even harder blow on Putin, and it's coming from a direction almost nobody expected. Putin's reliance on North Korea has quietly woken up an industrial giant he can neither control nor retaliate against: South Korea. According to South Korea's Yonhap news agency, reporting in late February 2026, the country's foreign ministry has been in active contact with European allies and NATO about sending military assistance to Ukraine. This single move sent real shockwaves through the Kremlin because it isn't simply about weapons changing hands or technology being shared. It represents a genuine shift in a balance Russia had spent 30 years carefully building across the Asia-Pacific region. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova's statement shortly afterward, warning that Russia would be forced to use what she called its right to asymmetric retaliation, is about as honest an admission of panic as diplomatic language allows. Asymmetric retaliation is really just careful wording for a simple truth. Putin doesn't currently have the ability to retaliate against South Korea in any direct, symmetric way, and understanding exactly why reveals a lot about how boxed in Russia has actually become. To understand how South Korea locked Russia into this corner, we need to look at what Putin's North Korea gamble actually cost him. At first glance, turning to Pyongyang looked like a smart, mutually beneficial move, a way to keep his exhausted army supplied with ammunition and additional troops. Putin traded advanced military training and battlefield experience in exchange for shells and soldiers. But in doing so, he effectively handed over one of the most important bridges in the entire Asian security landscape, and turned it against himself. It started with NATO's Pearl mechanism, activated back in July 2025. Pearl, standing for the Priority Ukraine Requirements List, is a straightforward but powerful system that lets allied nations contribute funding into a shared pool, which is then used to purchase critical American-made weapons and route them directly to Ukraine. South Korea stepping into this picture is genuinely devastating for Russia's position, and here's why. For decades, strict South Korean export laws had prevented Seoul from directly selling lethal weapons into active conflict zones. That policy of careful neutrality had always kept South Korea one cautious step removed from global crises. The Pearl mechanism quietly sidesteps that legal barrier entirely. Even without South Korea sending weapons directly, the hundreds of millions of dollars it channels through this system get converted into Patriot missile batteries protecting Ukrainian skies, high-precision ammunition, and critical air defense infrastructure. It isn't some clever legal loophole. It's a legitimate legal bridge, and the consequences for Russia are enormous. There's more to this than funding alone. South Korea's non-lethal technology sector is genuinely unmatched globally. Seoul can supply Ukraine with cutting-edge radar, systems, electronic warfare equipment, advanced communications gear, and top-tier ballistic protection equipment. A radar system or communications device that keeps a soldier alive on the battlefield matters just as much as the ammunition being fired at the enemy. This kind of technological support dramatically strengthens Ukraine's ability to survive and coordinate effectively under pressure. Just as Japan's similar contributions were described by NATO officials as meaningful progress, South Korea's entry creates a multiplier effect, freeing up other NATO members to focus their own budgets on lethal systems like HIMARS ammunition and additional Patriot missile batteries. But here's the part that really matters. South Korea has actually already been indirectly supplying the Ukrainian front for some time. With a defense export industry that exceeded $20 billion in 2025, South Korea has quietly been enabling weapons flows into Ukraine through European partners for years. Thanks to massive agreements with Poland, K2 Black Panther tanks and K9 Thunder howitzers have already made their way onto European soil. As Poland sent its older, Soviet-era equipment directly to Ukraine, it simultaneously restocked its own army with brand new South Korean-made systems. This has functioned as an indirect but remarkably effective supply chain, and formal participation in Pearl now makes that chain permanent and far harder to disrupt. Artillery and ammunition supply form the true backbone of this entire war. While Russia has been steadily burning through massive stockpiles inherited from the Soviet Union, it's been trying to maintain firepower using lower-quality artillery shells sourced from North Korea, a significant share of which reportedly fail to fire properly, detonate correctly, or hit their intended targets at all. Now Russia faces an industrial rival that's abundant in quantity and genuinely superior in quality. South Korea ranks among the world's largest producers of 155mm artillery shells, backed by an industrial base fully capable of scaling production dramatically during wartime. Companies like Hyundai Rotem, Hanwha Aerospace, and Korea Aerospace Industries are positioned to expand their production lines almost immediately once orders come in. If Seoul begins supplying the Ukrainian army directly or indirectly at scale, the number of shells raining down on Russian artillery positions will climb sharply. For a Russian military that has already lost much of its firepower advantage, launching large offensives or holding captured territory becomes significantly harder. A Ukrainian trench line equipped with South Korean technology becomes an incredibly difficult obstacle for Russian assault units to break through. K-9 howitzers, with their exceptional mobility and precision strike capability, are well suited to hunting down older, clunkier Soviet-era artillery systems. K-2 tanks, featuring advanced composite armor, active protection systems, and fire control technology capable of hitting targets accurately, even while moving at speed, possess real technological superiority over Russia's aging T-90 series tanks on the battlefield. South Korea's involvement through Perel is really just the opening move here. The bigger question is when, not if, Seoul eventually shifts toward direct lethal weapons transfers. When that day comes, the ammunition and manpower Putin secured from North Korea will suddenly look almost insignificant, because South Korea's industrial production capacity is large enough to dwarf North Korea's entire military arsenal combined. And Putin crossed that particular line with South Korea fully aware of what was at stake. It may go down as one of the costliest strategic miscalculations in recent history, and the bill is still being paid month after month. This entire shift is quietly undermining Putin's long war strategy from the inside. The Kremlin's original bet was straightforward, that Western support for Ukraine would gradually erode over time, worn down by election cycles and shifting political moods in democratic countries. But the fact that a major global economic player like South Korea has now thrown its weight behind this effort proves something the Kremlin really didn't want to hear. Time is no longer working in Russia's favor. As stockpiles across NATO countries have thinned out over years of steady support, brand new systems rolling straight off South Korean assembly lines are giving the Ukrainian army fresh room to breathe. And Moscow's entire plan for a grinding, patient war of attrition is being shaken at its foundation piece by piece. So here's where all three threads of this story finally meet. China quietly pulling away from a partner it never wanted to be this responsible for. North Korea skillfully playing both giants against each other for its own gain. And South Korea almost as a direct consequence of Putin's own choices, stepping onto the battlefield in a way nobody predicted at the start of this war. Putin reached for allies to save his army, and in doing so, may have permanently reshaped the entire balance of power across an entire region he once controlled with ease. So, what do you think? Will China actually push Russia toward a real exit from this war, or will Putin simply keep living with this uncomfortable dependence for as long as it takes? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to stay ahead of every twist in this unfolding story, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.